Imagine buying a quiet farmhouse in Ohio, only to uncover a secret so dark it was sealed away for 91 years. That's exactly what happened when a young businessman knocked down a wall of crumbling bricks, and what he found inside could rewrite America's medical history forever. Because behind those bricks wasn't just a basement, it was a time capsule of horror, a secret that powerful families had buried for almost a century. And at the center of it all, a doctor who turned an epidemic into his personal nightmare lab. But let's rewind. It all started in the sweltering summer of 1832. The air was heavy, the Ohio River carried whispers of death, and a new plague was marching north: cholera, the Blue Death. It had already wiped out thousands in New Orleans, then Cincinnati, then Portsmouth. And by July, it slammed into Marietta, a fragile little town with fewer than 2,000 terrified people. Into this chaos strode a man who looked like salvation, Dr. Amos Fletcher. Tall, razor-thin, gray eyes that cut through the soul, and credentials from the University of Pennsylvania. He was hailed as the town's savior, the man who could outsmart death. But what Marietta didn't know was that Fletcher wasn't there to save lives. He was there to play God. Fast forward to that sealed basement. The businessman thought he was just expanding a root cellar. Instead, he tore through a wall of bricks, and on the other side, shelves, jars, and tools that had no place in a farmhouse. It wasn't just a cellar. It was Fletcher's underground hospital. The air inside was stale, but it carried something worse: the lingering stench of secrets. Rusted surgical instruments lay scattered like weapons. Broken bottles still held traces of strange powders. And in the far corner, something far more chilling: rows of crude wooden bunks, shackled with iron restraints. Patients hadn't been treated here. They'd been trapped. And this was only the beginning. Because the deeper they dug, the more impossible the story became. What Fletcher had done during that cholera outbreak would horrify even his own colleagues. Wait until you hear what they found buried beneath the floorboards. The Blue Death may have terrified Ohio, but Fletcher's cure was worse than the disease. He experimented on the sick, dissected the dying, and transformed the Hawley farmstead into a chamber of horrors hidden beneath the earth. And the most terrifying part: this wasn't an isolated event. Families of influence had paid to keep this secret buried for nearly a century, because the truth threatened everything they stood for. But here's the twist. Every jar, every restraint, every bone fragment in that basement tells a story the history books erased. And if we follow them far enough, they may reveal a conspiracy stretching beyond Ohio. The question is, how much of this history was covered up, and how much still lies sealed away under towns across America? Because this was only the first wall to come down. What Fletcher left behind wasn't medicine. It was a warning. Dr. Amos Fletcher wasn't just another doctor. He carried himself like a man who'd walked straight out of Philadelphia's elite lecture halls and into this fragile frontier town. Tall, angular, eyes like steel, and with streaks of white in his hair long before their time, Fletcher radiated authority, the kind of authority desperate people trusted without question. In Marietta, where most healers were nothing more than barber surgeons or quack salesmen peddling miracle tonics, Fletcher looked like salvation. But salvation was the last thing he had in mind. Just 3 miles outside town stood the Hawley farm, 100 acres of rolling wheat fields and cattle pastures, anchored by a limestone farmhouse that Thomas Hawley, a Revolutionary War veteran, had built with his own hands back in 1798. By 1832, Thomas was gone, his son Marcus running the farm with his wife Sarah and their 3 children. The family was scraping by, debts piling up, their livelihood hanging by a thread. And that's when Fletcher came knocking. He didn't just want land. He wanted something darker: the Hawley farm's sprawling basement, cool stone-lined, divided into rooms perfect for housing patients or hiding them. Fletcher pitched it as an opportunity. "Let me turn your cellar into a private hospital," he told Marcus, "a sanctuary for the wealthy families of Marietta. The price? $50 a month. more money than the Holleys made in an entire season. To a struggling farmer, it sounded like a blessing. To Sarah, it sounded like a curse. 6 strangers in their basement. The thought chilled her, but debts don't wait, and Marcus knew this deal could save his family. By August, Fletcher moved in. Oil lamps flickered against damp stone walls. Wooden tables lined with gleaming instruments were set out like an altar to science. Beds, wash basins, chamber pots. The basement was reborn as a medical ward. To the untrained eye, it looked like progress, like hope, like the frontier's first step into modern medicine. But what the Holleys didn't know was that Fletcher had been fired just 6 months earlier from Pennsylvania Hospital. His dismissal, not incompetence, but something far more sinister. He'd been caught performing irregular procedures, twisted experiments the medical board refused to endorse. And now, with the Blue Death sweeping Marietta, Fletcher had the perfect cover. He wasn't here to cure cholera. He was here to finish what he had started in Philadelphia, no matter how many lives it cost. And the Holloway basement was about to become his secret laboratory. Skull, what they thought was a hospital, was actually a trap. Imagine trusting your dying daughter to the best doctor in town, only to discover he wasn't saving her, he was killing her. That's the horror families in Marietta faced in the summer of 1832. Dr. Amos Fletcher's so-called cure for cholera wasn't medicine at all. It was torture disguised as science, and his victims never stood a chance. Just 6 months earlier, Fletcher had been forced out of Philadelphia under whispers and sealed letters. He had experimented on the poorest patients' charity cases whose deaths were written off as inevitable. But instead of being disgraced, Fletcher saw opportunity. When cholera crept into Ohio, he set up shop in the Holley family's basement, promising cutting-edge European treatments no one else in Marietta could provide. The first patient arrived on August 15th, Elizabeth Whitman, just 22 years old, the daughter of a wealthy grain merchant. Her skin had already taken on the dreaded bluish tinge of the Blue Death. Her father, desperate to save her, handed Fletcher $25, a sum that could keep a laborer's family fed for a year. Fletcher assured him Elizabeth would receive the finest care available west of Philadelphia. But there was one condition: strict quarantine. No visitors for 3 days. That night, Elizabeth was dead. But it wasn't cholera that killed her, it was Fletcher. Inside that basement, his cure was as radical as it was brutal. Fletcher believed cholera was caused by corrupted humors in the blood, and the only way to save a patient was to purge them completely. His method: a chilling 1-2 punch of extreme bloodletting and mercury poisoning. Where most doctors drain just a few ounces of blood, Fletcher ripped out 10 times that amount, up to 2 quarts from a single patient. And while ordinary physicians gave mercury in grain-sized doses, Fletcher force-fed his patients lethal quantities of calomel, a mercury compound that burned through their bodies, inducing violent purges until nothing was left. The results were catastrophic. The weak collapsed instantly. The stronger ones suffered longer, writhing in agony, their bodies breaking down under the dual assault. To Fletcher, this wasn't failure, it was data. Because Fletcher wasn't just a doctor, he was a meticulous scientist of death. Every incision, every convulsion, every final gasp, he recorded them all in a leather-bound journal locked away in a wooden box. These weren't medical notes. They were trophies, proof of his obsession. And if you think Elizabeth Whitman was the only victim, you're dead wrong. Fletcher had only just begun. The Holley basement was filling with patients, and every single one of them was about to face the same horrific fate. Skull, what Fletcher called medicine, history would remember as madness. What Fletcher wrote in his journals reads like the cold, calculated diary of a killer. Every stroke of his pen documented not life being saved, but life being stolen. Patient exhibits typical cholera symptoms upon admission, he recorded of young Elizabeth Whitman. Commenced depletion at 2:00 p.m. with initial bleeding of 24 ounces. Pulse weakened but complexion improved. Administered 15 grains calomel with laudanum. Second bleeding of 20 ounces at 6 p.m. marked improvement in humoral balance. Third bleeding scheduled for midnight. To Fletcher, this sounded like success. But in reality, he wasn't healing her, he was dismantling her body piece by piece. Elizabeth's strength drained with every pint of blood. The mercury coursed through her system, burning her from the inside. By dawn, she was gone. Not a victim of cholera, but a victim of Fletcher's so-called cure. And her fate was just the beginning. Elizabeth's body was shoved into a crude grave behind the farmhouse, hidden from prying eyes. When her grieving father returned 3 days later, Fletcher met him with a mask of sorrow. "Your daughter died peacefully in her sleep," he said, voice heavy with practiced grief. "The disease progressed too quickly for even the most advanced medicine." And the father believed him. Overcome with gratitude that at least his daughter had been treated with dignity, he handed Fletcher an extra $10 for burial costs and left, never knowing the truth. But Elizabeth was Fletcher's last experiment. 5 days later, another patient arrived. Thomas Carmichael, a 45-year-old blacksmith. His family scraped together everything they had to buy him a chance at survival. For 4 days, he endured Fletcher's bloodletting and mercury. 4 days of agony, 4 days of false hope. And then, just like Elizabeth, he died. By September, the word had spread. Families from across southeastern Ohio flocked to the Holley farm, clutching their savings, desperate to keep their loved ones away from the overcrowded, chaotic public hospitals where prayer was the only medicine offered. Fletcher's Eastern credentials, his polished manner, his grave authority, all of it worked like a spell. To these people, he wasn't a fraud. He wasn't a butcher. He was the answer. But in reality, every new arrival sealed their fate. Because Fletcher's private hospital wasn't a sanctuary. It was a machine, a factory of death, and each patient that crossed the threshold only fed Fletcher's obsession. Skull, what the town saw as salvation, was actually a slaughterhouse. The Holley basement, once filled with wheat and jars of preserves, had become something else entirely. By the fall of 1832, it wasn't a cellar anymore. It was a conveyor belt of death, where desperate families paid top dollar for the privilege of watching their loved ones vanish into Fletcher's grip. Fletcher had engineered the perfect crime. Think about it. A disease so deadly that no one questioned the bodies piling up, families so desperate they'd pay anything for a sliver of hope, and an isolated farm that let him operate in total secrecy. Every variable worked in his favor. By October, Fletcher's system ran with chilling efficiency. He even had Marcus build a separate basement entrance. To the families, it looked like a smart quarantine measure. In truth, it was a funnel, a one-way path designed to keep prying eyes away. And Fletcher knew exactly how to bleed them, literally and financially. Merchants and professionals got charged $25, skilled craftsmen $15, farmers scraping by $10, but that was just the entry fee. Fletcher dangled special treatments, claiming they were the latest miracles from Europe. Families, blinded by grief and fear, dug deeper into their pockets without hesitation. Every advanced therapy was just another step toward death. At first, the Holloways were grateful. The farm's debts were gone. Money was finally flowing. But by October, Sarah Holley couldn't ignore what her ears told her each night. The groans rising from beneath the floorboards, the sickly sound of lives unraveling. "It don't seem natural," she whispered to Marcus one evening, fear tightening her voice. "All them fancy treatments, all that book learning, and still, every soul dies down there. Even Doc Hartwell in town saves 1 out of 3. Marcus tried to calm her, the way a farmer does when he's lost too many cattle to disease. "Rich folks die the same as poor folks," he muttered. "Maybe they just wait too long, thinking money will buy a miracle." But Sarah's instincts were sharper than his pragmatism. She felt it, something down there was wrong. And she was right, because Fletcher's obsession had already taken a darker turn. He wasn't just charging for treatment anymore. After each patient died, he began cutting them open, experimenting on their corpses under the guise of post-mortem examinations. Every body was another puzzle piece in his twisted game to conquer cholera. What families thought was hope was actually Fletcher's endless supply of test subjects. Skull, the Holleys thought they'd rented a basement. What they'd really given Fletcher was a morgue. The Holloways thought their basement was just a temporary hospital. But by late 1832, it had become something far darker, a secret morgue, a laboratory of horrors and Fletcher's personal gold mine. Because every single body that passed through his care didn't just die, it was harvested. Fletcher wasn't just treating patients. He was dissecting them, cutting into their bodies, scooping out organs, sealing them in jars of alcohol, and selling them to desperate medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. Schools that didn't care where the cadavers came from, as long as they were fresh. He even kept ledgers, cold, meticulous records that read more like profit sheets than medical notes. Patient Harris expired at 3:20 a.m. Immediate post-mortem yielded excellent liver and kidney specimens. Value, $12. Net profit, $37. The Holloway basement had officially transformed into a charnel house disguised as a clinic. Fletcher's tools gleamed under lantern light, scalpels, saws, and row after row of cloudy glass jars, each holding a piece of someone who once lived. But just as Fletcher's empire of death seemed untouchable, fate dealt him two brutal blows in November 1832. The first, a patient unlike any he had seen before, Martha Cunningham, the 16-year-old daughter of Marietta's most respected pastor. She wasn't half dead like the others. She was young, strong, and caught cholera early enough that with simple rest and fluids she could have survived. Which meant if she lived, she could talk, she could expose everything. And just when Fletcher thought he could control this risk, disaster struck again. A second, unexpected event crashed into his carefully constructed empire, one that would blow the lid off his entire operation. What happened next would turn Fletcher's quiet basement into the epicenter of one of the darkest scandals in early American medicine. Police car light, imagine walking into a basement expecting a hospital and instead finding a nightmare. This is the exact moment Fletcher's empire of death begins to collapse, and it starts with the return of one man. Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, Marietta's only other trained physician, had just come back from a medical conference in Columbus. Rumors swirled about Fletcher's miracle cures, and Hartwell wanted answers. On November 12, 1832, he rode out to the Holloway farm with nothing more than curiosity and professional courtesy. But when he opened that basement door, his life changed forever. The stone steps creaked as Hartwell descended into the cold darkness. He expected to find Fletcher checking on patients, maybe explaining some new quarantine method. Instead, what he saw nearly stopped his heart. On a wooden table lay Martha Cunningham, the 16-year-old daughter of a beloved pastor. She was unconscious, her face pale, her skin waxy, and beside her, two large basins, each brimming with fresh blood. Fletcher stood over her in a blood-stained apron, syringe in hand. A syringe Hartwell instantly recognized was filled with a lethal dose of calomel. But that wasn't the worst part. In the corner of the chamber, glass jars floated like grotesque trophies, each one containing human organs suspended in alcohol, hearts, livers, kidneys, all staring back like silent witnesses. Hartwell's voice echoed through the stone chamber. "Fletcher, what in God's name are you doing to this child?" Fletcher spun around, his wild eyes glowing in the lantern light, looking less like a physician and more like a butcher caught mid-slaughter. For a frozen moment, the two men locked eyes across Martha's dying body, one fighting for her life, the other calmly preparing her death. And then Fletcher spoke, his voice disturbingly steady. "Dr. Hartwell, I wasn't expecting you. Miss Cunningham is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy. I was just preparing to administer the final dose of mercurial purification. Hartwell rushed to Martha's side, checking her pulse, her pupils, his face tightening with horror. This girl isn't dying of cholera, she's dying of blood loss. How much blood have you taken from her? Fletcher opened his journal, reading the numbers with cold detachment. 42 ounces over the past 18 hours, with an additional 16 scheduled this morning. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. Hartwell froze. 42 ounces, nearly 3 quarts of blood. And in that moment the entire illusion shattered. Fletcher wasn't curing cholera, he was manufacturing death. But the biggest twist, what Hartwell did next would ignite a chain reaction that Marietta would never forget. Police car light. This was the moment everything exploded. Dr. Hartwell, standing in the blood-soaked basement, realized Fletcher had bled this child almost to death. What followed was not medicine, it was war. Their voices clashed like thunder, echoing through the farmhouse above. Fletcher, desperate and unhinged, defended his methods with fiery conviction, throwing out European medical theories like weapons. Hartwell fired back, horrified at every word, demanding Fletcher stop immediately and let him examine the other patients. But then silence. Hartwell moved through the basement looking for signs of life. The other beds were stripped, empty, nothing but stained sheets and shadows. And that's when the truth hit like a hammer. Martha was the only one left. Every other patient had died. "Where are your other patients?" Hartwell demanded. Fletcher didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate. His reply was ice cold. "Unfortunately, they succumbed to the advanced stages of cholera before my treatments could take effect. The disease is particularly virulent this season." But Hartwell wasn't buying it. He knew the numbers. Even in the deadliest outbreaks, cholera killed maybe 60% of its victims with proper care. Fletcher's success rate? 0. Every single patient dead. That wasn't medicine. That was murder dressed as science. Now Hartwell was trapped in an impossible storm. If he exposed Fletcher, the fallout would destroy everyone connected to this basement hospital. The Holloways who lent their home, the grieving families, some of the most powerful merchants, craftsmen, and landowners in Marietta. Their reputations would shatter. Generations of shame. But if he stayed silent, Martha Cunningham, barely clinging to life, would be just another body in Fletcher's graveyard. Hartwell chose action. He rushed to Martha's side, forcing fluids, giving rest, fighting to undo Fletcher's damage. Then he did something Fletcher never expected. He sent word to Reverend Cunningham and a handful of Marietta's most respected citizens. His message was chillingly simple. "Come at once. What I have to show you will change everything you thought you knew about Dr. Fletcher." And when those men gathered at the Holloway farm, what they discovered would ignite a reckoning the town would never forget. High voltage. Imagine this. The Holloway farmhouse packed with Marietta's most powerful men, Reverend Cunningham, Judge Putnam, Merchant Fearing, and Banker Gilman. These weren't just townsfolk. They were the backbone of the community, the men whose word could build or break reputations. And right there, Hartwell dropped the bomb. Fletcher wasn't saving lives. He was ending them. The air turned heavy. These men had trusted Fletcher. Some had sent family into his care. Others had vouched for him to neighbors. Now, standing above that basement of horrors, they realized the truth. They hadn't hired a healer. They had fed their loved ones to a butcher. Fletcher, cornered but defiant, tried one last gamble. He whipped out his leather-bound journal, his so-called evidence. With the tone of a university professor, he read aloud his notes, line by line, turning human suffering into clinical jargon. "Gentlemen, what you call brutality is nothing more than advanced European science. Every drop of blood drawn, every dose of mercury, was meant to cure, not to kill." But Judge Putnam wasn't buying it. His eyes burned with fury. His nephew had died on Fletcher's table just weeks before, and his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Are you telling us, doctor, that bleeding a 16-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted medical practice. Fletcher didn't even blink. In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes, the corruption must be drawn out before healing can begin. Miss Cunningham will prove the success of my methods. But destiny had other plans. Upstairs, as the men argued, Martha Cunningham's body finally gave out. Despite Hartwell's desperate efforts, she slipped away, her fragile frame too drained to fight back. The timing was catastrophic for Fletcher. Martha didn't just die, she died in front of witnesses. Her death ripped the last shred of doubt from the room. This wasn't medicine. It was cold-blooded murder, carried out under the guise of science. In that instant, Fletcher's world collapsed. The respected physician, the man with Eastern training and polished manners, was gone. In his place stood a killer, exposed before the very power structure that once embraced him. But now came the impossible question. How would these men, pillars of society, guardians of reputation, deal with the fact that they had empowered a monster? Because exposing Fletcher wouldn't just destroy him, it would expose them all. Police car light imagined this. Marietta's most powerful men, locked in a farmhouse at midnight, facing a choice so explosive it could wipe their entire town off the map. Do they expose Fletcher as the monster he truly is, or bury the truth forever? The stakes couldn't be higher. A public trial would mean chaos. Fletcher's crimes weren't just murder, they were betrayal. Merchants had paid him, judges had vouched for him, pastors had trusted him. If the truth got out, it wouldn't just ruin Fletcher. It would torch everyone's reputation, dragging Marietta's name through the mud for generations. Property values would crash, businesses would collapse, families would drown in shame. Judge Putnam, his own nephew dead at Fletcher's hands, put it in brutal terms. If this becomes public, it won't just destroy us. It'll destroy the entire community. Who will trade with merchants fooled by a killer? Who will trust a judge who recommended a fraud? Even Reverend Cunningham, whose daughter Martha had just died upstairs, agreed. His grief was bottomless, but he feared the ripple effect of scandal more than his own heartbreak. The families deserve truth, he said, voice breaking, but they also deserve dignity. A trial would punish the innocent along with the guilty. So the men hatched a plan. No courtroom, no newspapers, no scandal. They would confront Fletcher in secret, demand he vanish from Ohio, and bury the evidence unless he resisted. It was a compromise, fragile, uneasy, dangerous. But Fletcher wasn't about to go quietly. His voice, cold and defiant, echoed through the stone basement where he'd spilled so much blood. I would rather face trial than flee like a criminal. Expose me and I'll expose you. The Holloways, your merchants, your leaders, all complicit. If I fall, you fall with me. The room froze. Fletcher had flipped the game. He wasn't begging for mercy. He was threatening to drag them all down into the fire. And so the standoff began. Fletcher barricaded himself in the basement, his journals and specimens like weapons at his side. Above him, the most powerful men in Marietta argued, shouted, and pleaded, the farmhouse creaking with tension as the hours bled into dawn. Marcus Holloway, his face pale with terror, begged the group for a solution. He knew his family stood at ground zero of Fletcher's nightmare. One wrong move, and they'd be destroyed alongside him. The clock was ticking. One night, one choice, and whichever way they turned, somebody's world was going to burn. Because here's the catch. This wasn't just a battle to stop Fletcher. This was a battle to decide whether truth itself would ever see the light of day. Fire and trust me, the biggest twist hadn't even hit them yet. High Voltage, the story, hit its breaking point just before dawn, November 13th. Fletcher, cornered, desperate, and refusing to submit, made his final gamble. He tried slipping out through the basement's exterior entrance. But waiting in the icy dark were Judge Putnam and Samuel Fearing, shadows against the stone farmhouse, ready for him. Moments later, chaos erupted. By sunrise, Fletcher lay dead at the foot of the stone steps, his skull shattered. Judge Putnam swore Fletcher slipped, smashing his head against the limestone in a frantic escape. Samuel Fearing backed him up, insisting it was a tragic accident. But when Dr. Hartwell examined the body, what he saw told another story: injuries too violent, too deliberate to be explained by a simple fall. The truth was obvious. This wasn't just an accident, it was an execution. And yet, faced with the impossible choice, admit to vigilante justice and ignite scandal, or bury the truth and save Marietta, Hartwell caved. He falsified the record. Fletcher's cause of death: accidental trauma from a fall. Problem solved, or so they thought. Because killing Fletcher wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the cover-up. The farmhouse basement was a chamber of horrors: journals, surgical tools, jars of preserved organs, rows of dead patients misdiagnosed as cholera. It couldn't be explained. It couldn't be risked. So the leaders of Marietta made their darkest decision yet: seal it forever. By order of Marcus Holloway, desperate to shield his family's name, the basement entrance was bricked up, every trace of Fletcher's crimes entombed in stone, and with it, the truth suffocated beneath layers of silence. The official story spread like wildfire. Dr. Fletcher, a noble physician, had died tragically while treating cholera patients. The basement, closed to prevent infection. The patients who died under his care, victims of the epidemic, nothing more. But the truth was more chilling. A killer had been buried in honor, with Reverend Cunningham himself delivering the funeral sermon. Fletcher's grave marker still stands in Marietta Cemetery, a modest headstone etched with lies. Dr. A. Fletcher, 1796–1832, taken by accident in service to his patients. Only a handful of men knew what really happened in that farmhouse, and they swore an oath: never speak of it again. Yet history has a way of whispering, and Fletcher's secret, it wouldn't stay buried forever. Most believed the lie. Families accepted that their loved ones had perished of cholera, comforted by the thought that they had died under the care of a devoted physician, rather than abandoned in the chaos of the public hospital. The cover story worked so well, it became truth. Dr. Hartwell, though, carried the unbearable weight of what he had seen. He burned his notes, erased his own evidence, and swore never to speak of Fletcher's horrors. But silence came at a cost. Haunted by the screams from that basement, Hartwell drowned himself in whiskey, dead within 3 years, taking the last honest record of Fletcher's crimes into the grave with him. Meanwhile, Marcus Holloway set to work burying the past, literally. He quarried limestone from local rock, walling off the basement entrance until it looked like it had never existed. Ivy was planted to crawl across the stone, swallowing the scar. Then Marcus destroyed Fletcher's tools of terror, burning what could burn and scattering the rest in shallow, unmarked graves across his property. Within a year, all that remained was the sealed basement, a silent tomb locked in limestone and secrecy. The Holloway secret passed from father to son, Marcus to Thomas, Thomas to Robert. Each generation swore to guard it, each one too terrified of the shame that would come if the truth ever escaped. By then, the wall had become part of the farmhouse itself, indistinguishable from its original foundation. Later Holloways forgot it had even been built at all. And history, it rewrote Fletcher's sins into sainthood. The cholera epidemic of 1832 slipped into dusty records, remembered only in fatting gravestones. Fletcher, the butcher of Marietta, was now celebrated as its savior. Families named sons Amos in his honor. The Marietta Medical Society, blind to the horror buried beneath their feet, established a scholarship in his name. The Holloway farm thrived, generation after generation. Its fields yielded crops, its barns filled with livestock. But beneath the limestone, untouched and silent, Fletcher's nightmare laboratory still waited, sealed, festering, and forgotten. Because the dead don't stay buried forever. Imagine buying an old farmhouse, only to discover a nightmare that had been sealed for nearly a century. Marcus Holloway died at 78, carrying a monstrous secret to his grave in 1878. His wife Sarah followed a decade later, never once speaking of the hell that had unfolded in their basement. The place locals would only whisper about as Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors. By 1900, the last witnesses were dead, and the bricked-up cellar became nothing more than an odd curiosity, a forgotten scar too costly to unearth. Generations of Holloways inherited the farm. They thought about opening it. They almost did. But fear, money, and superstition kept them from breaking the seal. Then came the Great Depression. The Holloways lost everything. The farm passed to new owners, immigrants who spoke little English and knew nothing of Marietta's buried nightmare. They farmed the land, sealed off the colder parts of the house, and ignored the strange bricked-up section below. And so, through the 20th century, the farmhouse was sold again and again. Owners noticed the sealed basement, sure, but shrugged it off as water damage, structural repairs, something boring. No one dared to ask what was really behind the limestone wall. Until now. A young businessman from Columbus bought the abandoned Holloway farm, planning to turn the 19th century house into a rustic weekend retreat. Isolated, historic, cheap, it seemed perfect. But when he hired contractors to redo the wiring and plumbing, everything changed. The crew needed basement access. That's when they saw it, the wall, bricked up, perfectly sealed, out of place. At first they laughed, probably some botched renovation job. But then came the kicker. Building codes demanded that they check what was inside. Insurance required it. There was no escape. So on a freezing spring morning, they fired up the power tools and began tearing down the very barrier Marcus Holloway himself had built in 1832. The mortar was like stone, fused solid over nearly 100 years. Every block pulled loose was a battle. Dust filled the air, the sound of grinding metal and shattering limestone echoing through the hollow house. And then it happened. The first sign that something was wrong. As the opening widened, a smell leaked out. Not dust, not mold, something else, something rotten. And that's when the nightmare of Fletcher's basement began to wake up. The smell hit first. Not dust, not mold. Something far worse, an organic, sickly stench that could only mean one thing, death. The workers froze. Their flashlights trembled as they peered through the hole. Behind the limestone wall, shadows took shape, wooden furniture, rusted metal, shards of glass catching the light. And then the owner did the unthinkable. He squeezed through the opening, his flashlight slicing through 190 years of darkness. With every step, history clawed its way back into the present. What he found would rewrite everything Marietta thought it knew. In the center of the room stood the table, Fletcher's table. The surface was stained black with dried blood that had seeped into the grain nearly 2 centuries ago. Around it, corroded scalpels, saws. And probes lay scattered across smaller desks, primitive surgical tools from a time when medicine blurred into butchery. Along the walls, wooden shelves sagged under the weight of glass jars. Once filled with preserving alcohol, the liquid had long since evaporated, leaving behind a crusted residue that told its own horrifying story. And then the most chilling discovery of all, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed, but its words, Fletcher's words, still sharp as the day he wrote them. Every entry a confession, every page a roadmap of systematic murder. The contractors backed away. The owner's hands shook as he realized the weight of what he was holding. This wasn't just a creepy basement. It was a crime scene sealed in time. Authorities were called. Within days, archaeologists, historians, and forensic experts flooded the farmhouse. The sealed basement became a living museum of horror, and what they uncovered next proved darker than even the oldest whispers of local folklore. Chemical analysis of Fletcher's medicine bottles revealed mercury levels so high they could kill a healthy man within hours. Bloodstains on the table and instruments showed traces from multiple individuals, evidence of repeated, deliberate killings. Fletcher wasn't just a doctor caught in a cholera epidemic. He was a predator hiding behind medicine, using trust as his scalpel. And the journal, it left no doubt. Fletcher had murdered his patients, not by accident, by design. What if I told you a single farmhouse basement exposed one of the darkest medical conspiracies in American history? And what if I told you Fletcher's journal wasn't even the worst part? Because when investigators dug deeper, they made a discovery that turned this from a chilling story into a full-blown nightmare. Behind the farmhouse walls, beyond the blood-stained table and rusted tools, they uncovered something unthinkable: 12 hidden burials. 12 lives erased, their remains stuffed into the earth like secrets no one ever wanted found. Fletcher's own journal recorded his killings, but the bodies revealed the truth. His victim count was far higher than he ever admitted. The number, at least 24 murders, in just 4 months, a death toll so staggering it dwarfed anything the frontier had ever seen. But here's the real twist. Fletcher didn't pull this off alone. The investigation ripped apart the idea of a lone mad doctor because the cover-up reached deeper than anyone dared imagine. Church records, death certificates, family documents, every piece of paper from the 1830s told the same story. The community knew, and they buried the truth. Court officials altered death records. Local leaders suppressed stories that could tarnish reputations. Even religious authorities, men of the cloth sworn to truth, gave false testimony to protect Fletcher's good name. This wasn't just murder. It was a conspiracy of silence. A whole town choosing reputation over justice, letting families bury loved ones without answers, while Fletcher collected fees that made him one of the richest men in the county. And just when historians thought the nightmare couldn't spread any further, it did. Because Fletcher wasn't alone. The basement discovery triggered new research across Ohio, and the patterns started showing up everywhere: other communities, other suspicious doctors, other spikes of unexplained deaths hidden during epidemics. The horrifying possibility emerged. Fletcher's crimes weren't unique at all. He might have been one of many predators disguised as healers, exploiting desperate families during plagues that already pushed society to the brink. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one farmhouse. It was about the very foundation of American frontier medicine, and how many trusted physicians were really just killers hiding in plain sight. And the final blow: Fletcher's success didn't come from brilliance or secrecy. It came from something far more terrifying: the community's willingness to look away. One farmhouse basement had forced America to ask, how many more Fletcher were out there, their crimes sealed behind walls, buried beneath fields, waiting for someone brave enough to break them open. This wasn't a story about death. It was a story about silence, and silence is the perfect place for monsters to thrive. Some basements should never be opened, but this one proved history was far darker than anyone dared believe. The excavation wasn't over in a day, or even a week. For months, teams of investigators chipped away at Fletcher's basement of horrors, uncovering layer after layer of secrets that had been buried for nearly 2 centuries, and every single discovery made the story darker. Local medical authorities finally admitted the unthinkable: Fletcher's murders were real. His patients weren't victims of disease, they were victims of a predator hiding in plain sight. And worse, the very leaders who should have stopped him had helped cover it all up. The truth cut deeper than any scalpel. Families who had once trusted Fletcher realized they hadn't just been betrayed by a doctor, they had been betrayed by their own community. Officials, church leaders, courthouse clerks, all of them had chosen silence over justice. And then came the moment that shattered generations of family history. Forensic analysis of the remains confirmed identities. These weren't nameless bones. They were grandfathers, mothers, siblings. People who had been told their loved ones died of cholera now faced the horrifying truth: their ancestors had been murdered. Imagine hearing that the tragic family story passed down for generations wasn't fate, it was murder. Descendants of the Holloway family described it as living a nightmare in real time. Some were horrified that their land had hidden such crimes. Others felt vindicated that the whispers about something bad in the basement had finally been proven true. But the investigation didn't stop with history. It forced terrifying questions about the present. Historians warned that even though medicine is far safer today, isolated practices and vulnerable patients still create blind spots. Could another Fletcher be operating right now, hidden, undetected for years? The farmhouse itself became a time capsule of evil. Fletcher's basement was preserved exactly as it was found: blood-stained tables, corroded instruments, and that infamous leather-bound journal documenting every lie, every crime, every betrayal. For researchers, it became the ultimate case study in how unchecked power, weak oversight, and community denial could enable a monster to thrive. But for the families, it was a wound that cut across generations. And as the last pages of Fletcher's journal were read aloud, one haunting thought echoed louder than all the rest. Skull, if this basement went hidden for 200 years, how many others are still out there, waiting to be found? What started as a farmhouse renovation had turned into a nightmare discovery, the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about history. Fletcher's surgical instruments, rusted but intact, weren't just tools, they were weapons in a doctor's private killing field. And those glass jars, they weren't relics, they were trophies, preserved specimens, silent witnesses to nearly 2 centuries of hidden crimes. The property owner stood at a crossroads: rebuild the farmhouse into a modern retreat, or preserve it as one of the darkest crime scenes in American history. His decision: preservation, because what lay beneath those floorboards wasn't just horror, it was evidence. Evidence so powerful it forced historians to rewrite medical history from the ground up. And then came the ripple effect. Fletcher's basement lit a firestorm across Ohio. Researchers began digging, literally, into other historical sites, and what they found sent chills through every small-town archive. Suspicious clusters of deaths during the cholera epidemic of the 1830s. Patterns too precise to ignore. Fletcher wasn't just a lone madman. He might have been part of something bigger. But here, where it gets even darker, families who had carried vague stories of mysterious deaths discovered through genealogical research that their ancestors weren't victims of cholera at all. They were victims of murder. Descendants banded together, demanding memorials that screamed one message: never again can silence protect power. And then came the graveyard controversy. Fletcher's resting place, Marietta Cemetery, in the section reserved for the community's most honored citizens. Victims' descendants petitioned for his removal. Some said his body should be cast out, erased from the circle of honor. Others argued that his headstone should remain, a permanent scar, a reminder of how easily a community can be deceived when authority goes unchecked. The epidemic of 1832 had killed thousands, but Fletcher's murders were different. They weren't random deaths. They were systematic, cold, deliberate abuse of trust. He wasn't just fighting disease. He was weaponizing it. Medical ethicists who studied his case identified the perfect storm: isolated rural practice, desperate families clinging to hope, and a total lack of oversight. It was a recipe for monsters to thrive, and Fletcher had taken full advantage. And here's the part that keeps historians awake at night. Fletcher was only one man, which means the question still lingers like a shadow across history. Skull, how many other Fletchers are buried in America's past, still undiscovered, waiting in the dark? Imagine this. For nearly 2 centuries, a limestone wall stood silent, hiding one of the darkest secrets in American history. But here's the chilling part. This wasn't just about one murderous doctor. This was about an entire community choosing silence over justice. Because the discovery in the Holloway basement didn't just expose Fletcher's crimes. It raised a terrifying question. How many other physicians in early America used epidemics as a mask for fraud and murder? How many towns buried the truth to protect their reputations? And how many families passed down stories of heroic medical care, never knowing their loved ones had been butchered by the very man they trusted to save them? That limestone wall, it became more than just stone and mortar. It was a monument to denial, a symbol of how far communities will go to hide their shame. But here's the twist. Walls don't keep secrets forever. Truth has claws, and eventually it tears its way out. And then came Fletcher's journal, meticulous, detailed, every page dripping with the cold calculation of a predator disguised as a healer. His handwriting didn't just document treatments, it confessed murders. And the most haunting part, his victims trusted him because of his credentials. The betrayal wasn't random, it was systematic, weaponizing respectability itself. Today, that basement, once Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors, isn't just preserved as evidence. It's a warning, a place where researchers and the public can confront the brutal reality that oversight and accountability are not luxuries, they're lifelines. Because without them, healing becomes harm and trust becomes a trap. The biggest lesson: silence doesn't bury crime, it only delays justice. The leaders who thought they were shielding their neighbors from scandal actually created a shame that would echo louder and longer than anything they tried to hide. And when the wall finally cracked, when investigators stood face to face with the horror Fletcher left behind, even hardened professionals were stunned. What they saw wasn't just history, it was a mirror, a reminder that predators thrive when we look away. The truth was buried for 191 years, but once unearthed, it refused to stay silent. What if I told you that behind one ordinary farmhouse wall lay nearly 2 centuries of silence, lies, and the most chilling betrayal of trust in American medical history? This isn't just a story. It's a countdown to the moment when truth broke free from the limestone prison built to hide it. Because when investigators cracked open that basement, they didn't just find dust and stone. They found a crime scene frozen in time, a chamber deliberately preserved so the future would never forget what happens when power goes unchecked. Here's the twist: Fletcher's crimes weren't born from primitive 1800s medicine. No, they were born from choice. Cold, deliberate choices by a man who wore respectability like armor, who used authority to prey on the desperate. And his community, they let him. They sealed the truth away, protecting their reputation instead of protecting the victims. Every generation that walked above that limestone floor thought they were safe. But history doesn't stay buried. And Fletcher's basement ripped open a question far more terrifying than any epidemic. How many other doctors hid their crimes behind disease? How many towns silenced evidence instead of facing scandal? How many families carried heroic legends of healers who were actually murderers? That wall of limestone wasn't just stone. It was denial solidified, a monument to silence. 91 years later, it shattered, and with it, the illusion of safety. The journal, the instruments, the bones, all screaming one truth louder than any history book. The most dangerous predators don't hide in shadows. They stand in daylight, cloaked in credentials and welcomed with trust. Think about it. His patients trusted him not despite his status, but because of it. That betrayal cut deeper than the scalpel in his hand. And that's why Fletcher's crimes are more than history. They're a mirror. Because medical oversight may have improved since then, but every system is vulnerable when authority is worshipped without accountability. The basement that once caged horrors is now a warning to the world. Oversight, transparency, accountability. Without them, healing turns to harm and medicine becomes murder. Fletcher's story proves it. Silence never hides crime. It only delays justice, multiplies the damage, and ensures that when the truth finally explodes into daylight, it's 10 times more devastating. The leaders who sealed that basement thought they were saving their community from shame. In reality, they planted a time bomb of guilt, one that wouldn't stop ticking until the truth was uncovered nearly 200 years later. And when it did, even hardened historians and investigators were left shaken. Here's the wild part. Fletcher's crimes weren't isolated. They connect to the bigger, darker threads of American history: slavery, medical experiments, industrial abuse, all moments when communities chose silence over justice, all moments when the facade of respectability was weaponized against the vulnerable. Fletcher's laboratory isn't just his story. It's America, a reminder that truth cannot be buried, and when you try, it claws its way out, no matter how deep you dig. And here's the cliffhanger. How many more walls are still hiding stories like Fletcher's? How many basements, attics, or sealed rooms across America still whisper secrets waiting to be unearthed? Because if Fletcher's basement taught us anything, it's this: the biggest horrors in history aren't locked in the past. They're waiting to be discovered. Imagine this: a small Ohio farmhouse sealed behind limestone for 91 years. What investigators finally uncovered wasn't just a secret, it was a nightmare. And the craziest part: the monster behind it wasn't hiding in shadows. He was celebrated, respected, trusted. Dr. Amos Fletcher, a physician who turned his medical license into a license to kill. He didn't stalk alleys or wear a mask. He operated in plain sight, his crimes shielded by credentials and community respect. And the people who trusted him most, they paid premium prices not for healing, but for murder disguised as treatment. But here, where it gets darker, this wasn't just medical fraud. This was betrayal on a generational scale. Families who thought they were preserving loved ones' dignity discovered, nearly 2 centuries later, that their ancestors were deliberately sacrificed. And the wall of limestone that kept this horror sealed, it wasn't protecting the town, it was protecting its reputation. For 91 years, Fletcher's leather-bound journal sat untouched, documenting each murder with chilling precision. The proof was there the whole time. But here's the twist: evidence means nothing without courage. And for nearly a century, no one dared open it, no one dared confront what it revealed. Silence became complicity. Denial became heritage. And this raises the question: if Fletcher could run his basement of horrors in broad daylight, how many other so-called healers throughout history did the same? How many other basements, sealed rooms, and hidden chambers still whisper with crimes buried under the weight of denial? The terrifying truth is this: the greatest predators don't always hide in darkness. Sometimes they stand in white coats, holding titles of respect, weaponizing trust itself against the vulnerable. So, what do you think? Did investigators really uncover everything Fletcher left behind? Or could other walls, other locked rooms across America, still be hiding secrets waiting to explode into daylight? If this story chilled you to the bone, drop a comment, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries, and hit subscribe, because the biggest twist, the scariest stories, are the ones still sealed, waiting to be found.